Hi, welcome to the Unfiltered Show. My name is Nathan, and that is Paul. Very nice to join up with you again, Paul. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you, Nathan?
Yeah, really good. We're joined today, as you can see over there, by Remkus de Vries. How are you, Remkus?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Nice to have you with us. And the topic in question today is something that I think it's fair to say Remkus has a great deal of experience with. We're going to be talking today about website performance. Just to give us a little bit of background into yourself, Remkus, would you just give us a short potted bio of who you are and how come you've got performance as a moniker for what you do?
Yeah, so for the last 19 years, I've been building WordPress sites, and I've always focused on complex sites. Complex sites usually have a component of performance to them, and I just seem to like that more than just regular old builds. So for the last, what is it, 8, 9 years, I've been more and more focusing on the performance side of things. So what I do is I optimize WooCommerce WordPress sites in general for high traffic and scalability without introducing complexity. So that's essentially my prime goal. Anything having to do with that. So whether that's optimization on the front end or uh, whatever you do in the code itself, that gets me excited, and that's where I find my joy.
I guess one of the interesting things about this subject, and we're going to delve really deeply into all different parts of it, is that this subject apparently has no end. Because what was true several years ago is no longer true.
It changes.
The browsers are changing, the
Yeah.
technology that we're changing is changing, the internet speeds that we're all able to access, that's all changing. The devices that we hold in our hands, it's all up for grabs. And so this conversation is very timely and will always be timely. But I guess it's a fairly basic entry, but we've got to begin somewhere. So I'm just wondering, Remkus, if you could just tell us what website performance is, and probably the most important part is why does it even matter?
It's essentially a philosophy. So it's the idea that your presentation, your website in the browser, any URL needs to get there as fast as possible. And that's not just the part where it actually renders in the browser, but it also is the part where, from the moment you hit enter in the address bar, the time that it's required to actually have the server generate that particular page, but it's also what's inside of that page that has a determining factor on whether it's perceived as fast. And the perception of fast is an interesting one. You could say that's a subjective thing, but it turns out there's an objective part in every single person when they flick through a site that responds within, I think it's 3/10 or something. It is perceived as instant. So that means if you can get there, you have a very different experience versus browsing on a site where it's maybe a second, second and a half, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. And that gives a very disjointed experience. And for instance, if you connect that to commerce, you'll see an increase in revenue simply by making the site as fast as you can get it. And the base principle behind it is essentially about not just the performance, not just making a site fast for the sake of making it fast, but it matters because it reduces whatever the server has to do. So it's about energy consumption.
Mm.
It's about a greener version, a more sustainable version of your site, your pages. It's way more than the little short sentence like making my sites fast is good because people like it. They do, but there's a lot more to it.
So essentially, are you saying that there's kind of like two sides to this argument? There's the human perception side where obviously I can pick up if a site is very slow, and it seems like zero point 0.3 of a second is some metric of anything lower than that is basically immediate to me.
Yeah.
Anything after that, the longer it is after that, the more I become frustrated. So there's that sort of personal component, but also there's presumably some metric which important institutions like Google are taking notice of
Yep.
because they would like the web to be uh, fast in every way. And so they give a sort of boost, if you like. They give some nod to websites which manage to get under a certain period of time loading.
Yeah, yeah, they do. So all things considered equal, from one site to another site, the one that is the fastest will get the highest priority in terms of rankings and stuff like that. It's not the be all and end all determining factor, but it is something that as content is getting more and more difficult to uh, position yourself in a way that you're highly dominant, the performance of your site becomes an extremely important factor in differentiating what you do versus what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, I guess it would be unfair if a site which has been around for 10 years and has been pumping out great content but is modestly slow would
Yeah.
be beaten by a site which launched just last week.
No, but that is what is actually happening.
Hmm.
I see examples of this. So it doesn't necessarily mean that old sites are better than new sites. It simply means on the value of that particular article, uh, you know, domain rank has its place. There is Google doesn't say it exists anymore, but it does. So there are factors that help when you have an older site. But I've seen year-old sites perform extremely well in highly competitive markets just because they're doing a lot of other stuff really well. I've seen a few sites that I've helped optimize. I've seen a few sites they were slowly declining, yet the quality of their content was on the rise. Their internal linking was better. Their strategy on the whole was better, and yet they were sinking slowly in traffic. Um, and then the other version is there as well. So everything done perfectly, but a relatively young site. You can win, is what I'm saying.
If we look back 20, 25 years to the birth of the internet, I remember dial up and really, really slow speeds. But now, I've got a 5G phone that has, its fastest, in terms of internet speed than anything we've ever had before.
Yeah.
And we see people with, I've got a gig connection at home, I think, with my broadband.
Yep.
Why, if speeds are getting better on the devices that we use and our internet speeds and Wi-Fi generally fast, why does performance matter, even though we can download things quicker than ever before?
So that is a multifaceted answer, because even though you're experiencing fast speeds, doesn't mean everybody else is. This goes especially if you have a site that caters to a worldwide audience. Um, you know, in Europe, in general, we're experiencing high speeds everywhere. United States as well, for the most part. But I already say for the most part because there are areas in the United States where it's very difficult to get a good and decent, stable connection. And then there's lots of countries where the speed is in no way a given one. So you want to optimize for everyone. That's the first answer. The second part is by optimizing, you're also playing it smart. So that means, for instance, let's say you do a few expensive types of queries on your site, right? So you're combining a bunch of stuff in the context of WordPress. There's a couple of custom post types. You do a comparison between the two, and you pull in some taxonomies as well. And there's a lot of data in there. You can then say, look, it doesn't matter. The result is there, and it happened fast. But from a pure energy consuming perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense to actually have that query being repeated on every single page load. So the smarter way of doing things is making sure that if you can cache that in one way or another, whether that's within WordPress itself by a transient or in object cache or the actual output, for instance, with a Cloudflare business plan, anything that you're doing to optimize whatever data and the amount of data that has to stream through whatever pipeline is a good one, because the benefits of it are not just what I see and what I don't see. The benefits go way further than the limitation of all of those who are using broadband connections, because it's not a limitation in our actual use, because I enjoy a fast connection just like the next person, but it does hide a lot of stuff.
Right.
A lot of little things, a lot of big things, and stuff that I just don't see because it happened fast enough. So you can say, what is my real problem here and what is being solved? There's a lot more solved by producing performance sites than just the perception of whether it's fast or not.
I'm going to ask a question which is going to be different from anything else that we ask, because I think most of the rest of what we talk about will be reasonably technical in nature, so all of the things that are going on behind the scenes, hosting and the website and the CMS and all of that kind of thing. But just a personal question. When you encounter a, air quotes, slow website, do you find it to be a frustrating experience? What I'm asking is really, I wonder if over the last decade or something, our capacity to cope with things like that has just dwindled, because the expectation now is that everything will be quick. And so that
Yeah.
site that doesn't present within the first second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds, the frustration levels rise and you genuinely do click away. I know for myself that that is the case.
Yeah.
I don't see some pixels coming onto the screen more or less immediately. There's this sense of, "Ugh, what the heck?" And I wonder if that was true for you. So it's anecdotal, really, but I wonder if you can provide evidence about you and that.
So I remember the first time I went online, um, visiting a site. Don't ask me which site, but I remember there were pictures there. And those of us who are old enough to remember what that was in the early 90s, you essentially saw a picture load line by line. And
Yeah.
that was normal. That was just how it worked. And as the internet got faster, as technology got faster, that changed our perception of what is fast. So for me personally, I am annoyed um, quite a bit if I encounter a site that is slow, and it doesn't need to be slow. So whether they're using cheap hosting and there's too many people on there, whether they're just not thinking about what they're putting on that page. For instance, if you add a YouTube embed at the top of the page, and you have to wait for all the scripts for YouTube, the YouTube scripts to load in, and then the thumbnail for the YouTube, and then the image, the video is halfway there as well. That's adding a lot of load that makes zero sense. So lazy load that. Show this the thumbnail, and when you click on it, then you change it for because there's an expected behavior to be some sort of slowness in those types of interactions. So if those things are not handled, solved in a smart way, I anecdotally am very annoyed. Yes.
And it's interesting as well, because you and I'm going to guess Paul is in this as well. We're all old enough to know that we know that the internet has improved over time.
Yeah.
But I have children who've grown up in the era of broadband, and I have noticed that their expectation, that there is almost no tolerance for that. If something doesn't work right
Yeah.
away,
Yeah.
and
They
they're the
assume.
future, right? They're the people that are going to be consuming the
Yeah.
internet in the days, weeks, months, years to come. So we've got to cater to them as well.
My children just the same. My youngest is 16, about to be 17, and my eldest is 25. Uh, my eldest has seen slower times, but my youngest had absolutely no clue what that means. A slow site. It's just there, right?
Yeah.
I punch it in and it's there. That is a very different perception. So yeah, the perception is most certainly changing for everybody. Everybody. So I enjoy watching Formula One, and if you look at it from the perspective of if they're going for for the qualifications, and you see the times being in some cases a couple of thousands of seconds slower, and there's the difference between position 1, 2, or 3. That perception is ridiculous, because if they would drive together, cross the line together, you wouldn't see the difference. Yet when we project that on, when we display them simultaneously, you would see the difference. Like, okay, slightly faster, slightly faster. Oh, that is the fastest. So you can see it, and it's the adjustment to that we're starting to understand has a very large tendency for us to find normal, whatever the new fastest is. So if you compare Formula One, the differences in time between now and say 20 years ago, big difference. So even the slowest is second and a half slower. I mean, what is a second and a half? That's some sites load in that speed, and we are kind of still okay with that. So the perception is just it's changed tremendously, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
So moving on, we're going to ask Remkus all about the problems that websites pose. And the intention of this section really is to outline the problems, not to offer the solutions necessarily, but just to tell us what the problems are in terms of how sites are impacted. So what are the factors which will impact how quickly your website loads and performs?
Quite a few, actually. There are some things happening inside of the actual content that you are creating. There's some things happening in the application you're using to do it. There's some things happening on the server and the caching that is or isn't working as it should on that server. But there's also stuff happening before it actually hits your server. Key factors, if we're looking at the most common thought solution to performance problems, is hosting. So there's a web hosting you can have in various ways. Some of them are great for fast sites. Some of them look like they're great, but they're not because they're hiding. Um, Things like that. If you're looking at content, the most common bottleneck would be the amount of images, the sizes of the images, how they are loaded, the version of images that you're loading. Alongside with images, I would say JavaScript. There's loads of libraries being loaded on pages where they're absolutely doing nothing, yet you're loading them repeatedly. Um, so the actual size of the page in total, which is a combination with the images, the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript, and the PDFs, and all of those things. But there's also small things like redirects, HTTP requests, which are solved right in front of the site, right? So anything happening on the DNS level, everything, like the whole layer has an impact in one way or another. Um, here's one that most people don't think about. So your server, if it's quite busy, if you have a busy site, you'll have a lot of people on your site, which is a good sign. But most people don't really start investigating how much of those site visitors are actually bad actors, uh, using up valuable resources, and those have an impact on your performance. So there are so many factors. Every single one that I've mentioned, I can deep dive into even more specific things. But it's a very wide array of things that you want to optimize.
If we just take hosting for a start, if you're looking at hosting, for instance, what are the good things to be looking for, and what are the things that you would avoid? So I expect people might be aware of shared hosting or dedicated server hosting or serverless hosting. Is the one that's better than another? Do different platforms offer those in different ways? What would you be looking at if you wanted to improve a company's website hosting platform?
So there are some benefits in the type of hosting, so the architecture that they're using. I generally want to stay away from shared hosting, when that's meant to be a really performant site. But actually, the most determinant factor for me is how are they performing uncached? 'Cause that leads everything else. So I've seen shared hosting or a version of shared hosting that is just blazingly fast uncached. Then I'm way less concerned about the shared hosting component if the hosting company has that problem solved correctly. I've seen premium advertised as premium WordPress hosting, where essentially their performance is fast because they're caching, and they're caching really, really well. But as soon as somebody enters that site in an uncached version, and that can be anybody who's logged in, anybody in a shopping cart having something in there, anybody visiting that site through a cache busting URL, so for instance, a MailChimp link or anything like that, and they will experience a slow site. So it's not necessarily about the technology. It's not necessarily about the how much RAM do I have and how much this and that. I need to know the server specs and all that. I don't care for that too much. I want to see results, and results can be tested, and the results can be tested in a way that you can compare them. But you need to be knowing what you're testing. And if you're testing cache, you're not really testing hosting, you're testing cache.
And how would you test that? So do you have any tools specifically that you use to test for that?
I have a very wide array of tools. Some are custom based what I can do in SSH in the terminal. Some are tools that we all know, whether that's Pingdom or
Mm,
Google Lighthouse,
yeah.
Core Web Vitals, all those things. There are a lot of different types of testing. The only thing that you need to be aware of is that what you're testing is consistently done in the same fashion. So
Yeah.
if you're testing, you should be testing uncached. My favorite tool is the tool that we're developing, ScanFully, where we're trying to solve this problem in a more concise way. So it's not one metric that we're actually using. We're using multiple metrics where the result of that gives you a better idea of what your site is actually, on how your site is actually performing. But there's no one tool that rules them all currently.
Okay, so Remkus, how do we tackle the performance of images? What are the things that we can do there?
A lot. So it starts with uploading. Whatever you're uploading needs to be in a needs to match what the intended goal is, right? So if you're using an image for a logo, you want a high quality solution there. The main difference seen between images is the JPEG and the PNG difference. For a logo, you need the highest quality. It needs to be crisp. You typically want to use PNG. For general images, you want to use JPEG. So that's the first distinction. Then both of those files need to be saved in a web format, and both of those files need to be ideally resized in a matter of where it makes sense. So if you're displaying a 760 by 300 pixel image, it makes zero sense to upload something that is 3,000 pixels wide and I don't know what is that, 5-6 MB. WordPress will make a featured version of that if you have that defined, but it still doesn't make a lot of sense to start uploading that's that big. So it starts with making the right choice before uploading. Now, the second part is when you're actually optimizing images, there's a lot that you can do. So, for instance, a smart choice would be to use WebP as your image format. So that means not all images will be a better version when they are in a WebP format. So if you're doing that, then you have uploaded the correct version and you're displaying the best version of that in the browser that is compatible to use it. My favorite way to do that is using a Cloudflare plan, the Pro plan, and that has image optimizations, things like this, where you can just say, you know what, I know that your origin is a PNG or a JPEG, but go ahead and turn this into a WebP formatted images on the fly. And maybe the first one is a little bit slower, but every single one after that is cached and it will be faster and in a more optimized version. Then the next question is in terms of images you're using for displayment. So a logo, but maybe a background image that has some nice, I don't know, waves and stuff like that in it. You should consider using an SVG version of that image instead of actually just thinking in the binary of PNG and JPEG.
WordPress allows you to lazy load images. That's correct, isn't it? And to be able to show different sizes of images depending on the device or the width of the browser that you're using. And I think those are important things to ensure that you have in your website right from the start.
Yeah. So the optimization doesn't stop at the choice of format. That's essentially where it starts. So you have the first two steps, which is deciding the image you're going to upload, deciding in which version you're going to display it. And then the third is indeed, how best can I serve this image in a most optimized version at the time that it is actually needed. So lots of stuff was already inside of WordPress. There's a few optimization plugins that solve this to a higher degree. I think we said this in the beginning. It is essentially a never-ending story because the optimization levels that you can continue to do is just doesn't stop. So one of the things I particularly like, again, this is referring to the Cloudflare Pro plan. It has an image resize function. So instead of WordPress having to convert a image to a specific size, Cloudflare takes care of that for you on the fly simply by you defining what that URL needs to look like and what size, which version of optimization needs to happen at the image. All of that just happens through their platform. And that's a beautiful way to solve a lot of optimizations problem in one go.
And having caching and a CDN for images is incredibly important, right? Because the impact of the site or the server having to generate and serve that image is completely removed by the use of a CDN.
Yeah, CDNs are a great solution. I will say this, CDNs have a level of efficiency, and you need to be aware that that is not 100%.
What do you mean by that?
So it means depending on where you are, you might not see a cached version of that image. Whether you're on the other side of the world, whether you're using a different data storage where the cached version hasn't arrived just yet. There's various ways of not caching an image, even though you intended to. A CDN solves it the best way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that 100% is cached. So you shouldn't assume that it is.
That's a really good way of putting it, I think, because I think, CDNs have different edge locations, don't they? And they're moving stuff to the edge, but they will remove it from the edge at some point, either if it's not used, perhaps, or it's expired, or its headers are expired.
Yeah. Cache headers are a great indicator of something that is put there to be sort of static, but it's not static because whether your cache header is set at 4 hours, 8 hours, 24 hours, I don't know. But there's a moment in time where it won't be there and it will take a little time to get it fully cached again.
It's interesting you were mentioning the point which I think is often overlooked is to do some of this work before you upload it anywhere. So, the image is going to be a maximum of 1200 pixels or 600 pixels, whatever it may be. Begin there before you put it anywhere online, get it to that maximum size and then work from there. And sounds like, you've got Cloudflare working for you, but there's a whole range of different things that you can do in the WordPress space, lots of different plugins which will
Yeah.
attempt to do this work for you. So yeah.
With this basically, with this, I mean performance optimization. What this basically boils down to is it's a philosophy. It's an architectural decision that you're making, and that means every single layer that is to do with content creation on that site, as well as the presentation layer creation. So the theme, the plugins that interact with it, every single thing is acting as a whole. You cannot just pick one thing and say, I'll optimize that and we'll call it a day. It's not. The same thing, the same what I said about images not necessarily always being 100% cached, even though CDN is in place. The same goes with regular caching, right? That is not 100%, regardless of whether you're logged in or in an e-commerce setting or something. Cache doesn't always serve 100%. It's just not how the world works. Maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, we'll have way more solid solutions that are just way better dependent of each other and solving things smarter. But right now, you should not assume stuff is cached. Therefore, that's never how you approach whether hosting is good or bad.
Okay, let's move on and talk about JavaScript. Now, I have an intuition that we could possibly devote a whole episode just to JavaScript, in all honesty, because it's
Absolutely.
almost everywhere we go online. But what are some of the low-hanging bits of fruit that you can mention, generic advice for how to deal with JavaScript and all of that on your website to make it more performant, Remkus?
When you're checking your site for core web vitals or even Lighthouse, it will tell you how you're handling your JavaScript. It will tell you if you are using large libraries. It will tell you there's too much going on inside those libraries. It will tell you. So to learn how your site is actually behaving with all the JavaScript that is being loaded, That's the first place to look, because it gives you an idea of where are you? What, you have your performance budget, and if all of that is going to large libraries, large JavaScript libraries, then that's the thing you want to tackle first. The thing that is the most obvious thing to look at right after that is deciding which libraries, which .js files should be loaded on what page specifically. A wonderful tool I like using for this is Perf Matters. It allows you to define per page and quite smartly use conditionals whether a piece of JavaScript should be loading or should not be loading on a particular site. So for instance, if you're using a contact form and that contact form plugin is activated, and most of them load all of their JavaScripts by default on all of WordPress's pages. Doesn't make a lot of sense if that's on the front page and there's no contact form. Doesn't make a lot of sense on the archives. Doesn't make a lot of sense on the blog post. Most of the times it's either a dedicated services page where your call to action is fill out this form, or maybe on the contact page, that sort of stuff. So Perf Matters allows you to say, I do not want to load that piece of JavaScript on this particular page. So that is just simply removing JavaScript. The problem of having large pieces of JavaScript doing lots of different things, so the actual computing power required to execute what they're saying you should be executing on every single page load, that is an entire different beast. And yes, we can spend a full hour on just that particular answer. But the TLDR here is make them efficient for what they need to do, and exactly only that.
And in terms of being able to load JavaScript scripts on a page, there's two key flags, aren't there? There's defer and there's async. Can you just give us a brief rundown of the difference between the two, and why would you use one in which instance you would use them in?
So defer is the easiest one to understand, but it essentially means we do want this piece of JavaScript library, this JS file, we do want this to load on this particular page, but it doesn't need to do anything in the first part where it loads. It just needs to be there once the site visitor decides to interact with that particular piece of the site that needs that particular piece of JavaScript. That's defer. So you can say, instead of loading this, one of the first things, just move it all the way back, kind of ignore it until we're almost done, and then maybe in the last microsecond start loading it. Async means essentially is a version of that where you don't necessarily need it in exactly the same loading time that it's defined, but it needs to do something somewhere later, and it's dependent on something that needs to load first. There's probably a smarter way to explain that, but this is the one that comes to mind now. But it's that in general, you'll mostly be using defer, and async means you'll have a deep understanding of what that particular file actually is doing and what it is dependent on, and where in the process of loading the web page it needs to do what. It's it usually means you're well versed in what it does and how it interacts. Defer is easier to explain because it just means I don't need it on load. I just need it somewhere at the end.
Just wait till everything else has happened and bring it in at the end. So when we do a lot of reporting in Post-Speed Insights, we're looking at Core Web Vitals. A lot of the JavaScript libraries that get complained about is Google Tag Manager or Google Analytics. Ironically, given that it's Google's own test. Google Tag Manager, downloads a script that then goes and gets other tags and JavaScript files, doesn't it? Do you recommend the use of Google Tag Manager, or maybe Google Analytics, or do you recommend that actually that hurts performance and you should potentially look at using something else?
And you potentially should. You have a few questions there. So the first one, would you recommend Google Tag Manager? So when I do a optimization, there are two caveats that I give. I say, yes, I can make this perform as blazingly fast as humanly possible, given the constraints of what your site is actually consisting of. But there are two things I cannot, or very poorly optimize. One is Google Tag Manager, or I should say all of Google's products. And the second is advertising scripts, because sometimes that's Google, sometimes that's something else. I have little to no influence on what that does. So I just kind of have to accept that. And I can show them it's working because if I use Brave as a browser, that essentially blocks anything that is in one way or another connected to advertising or tracking and all that stuff. So I can show them, look, if we're blocking something on browser level, then the actual site rendered, here you go. You can see that it's this fast and it's doing that and all of that. All of the optimizations work. But as soon as you start adding those, it becomes a lot less manageable. So in some cases, that's just simply adding a full second.
Yeah.
And you can defer all you want, but at a certain point, it's not going to do the recording as well as you intended. So what are you doing really? It makes it a difficult thing. There is one way to solve some of this, without really diving into how to optimize and what can I and what should I store locally and all of those things. Inside of Cloudflare, again, they're just solving so many pain points when it comes to performance or optimization. So I'm probably going to refer to them a few more times. But they're solving something there where you can have the Google Ads, the GA4 implementation of the code. You can do that on the level of Cloudflare instead of on the level of the site. And it's a standalone feature. You can, I have a screen open here, right here. And it essentially is nothing more than you just adding your tracking code to their piece of integration, and then it loads, and that's it. So it doesn't actually happen on your server. It doesn't actually happen at the level of Google, but they're solving something for you. So things like that is what you were doing to be optimizing these things.
There's a lot of talk about headless websites, and obviously single page applications, React apps have been with us for a long time now, a number of years. And that was very much led by a drive to move operations to the client side, to the client side device. And now I sense that there is a drive to move that back server side.
Yeah.
The circle of development, as you know, as old people have noticed, server side, client side, server side, client side. But my concern always has been around when you're talking from a performance point of view, the amount of code that you need to deploy to the client side before that site can run effectively and efficiently. And I know that nowadays you can do much more with server-side rendering. So you server-side render and then you push to the client side and you hydrate. But do you think that it is still, it is performant, I think is the question. Do you think it can be performant? Usage of a single page app or, a headless site in that way?
So I've never been on the team headless. For the simple reason is it's introducing a boatload of complexity. There's a lot of stuff you have to work around. And my general philosophy in this is that I'd like to keep it as simple as I possibly can. So if the question you then have to answer, what problem is going headless actually solve? And I've not really heard a problem I can't solve in a simple way differently, just by using a proper hosting stack that knows how to handle performance, for instance, just by introducing Cloudflare in a smart way. I just cannot be convinced to introduce that level of complexity when it barely solves one problem, but introduces 10, 15 others. So is it worth it? I'm sure there are plenty scenarios and people can come into the comments and explain me all of the different scenarios where going headless was the only solution to make something work. I'm sure they're there, and I'm sure if I start collecting that, it'll be hundreds, maybe thousands. But that's not necessarily saying that deserves the time and energy you put into it. I much prefer optimizing things where I can and where I have full control of the stack, where I don't need to add complex solutions and middle workers and all of those things to make forms work, for instance, to make e-commerce work. Can I make it work? Sure, I can. And if you need a recommendation for somebody to do it, I know plenty of people I can refer to you. But do I see it as a necessity, as something that needed to be happening? No, not necessarily.
Now, it occurs to me, Remkus, that there might be a proportion of people listening to this who don't even know what we're talking about when we talk about redirects. So maybe you could just outline what the problem is quickly and then suggest some possible remedial action.
Right. So a redirect is essentially saying to the traffic that is hitting your site, no, this is not the URL you wanted. We actually are going to forward you to a different URL. When a redirect is happening, that costs time. When that is happening on something that receives a lot of traffic, that's going to cost a lot of time, and it's also going to cost resources. So if you need to do redirects, again, Cloudflare is a great way to solve that problem first. So it doesn't happen on server, but it happens before you hit the server. Secondly, you essentially don't want to have redirects on your site. The only redirect that is acceptable is the one from HTTP to HTTPS, and possibly from the non-www version to the www version, or vice versa, whatever your preference is. Those are the only two that make sense. All the other ones you want to solve in content. So if you're, if you're deleting an article, if you're changing a URL of an article, of a page, moves from a main page to a subpage or vice versa, whatever, the URL changes. So instead of just doing that and having some redirect manager take care of that redirect, you want to solve that. So that redirect needs to be there, sure, but you want to internally solve it by updating all the other pages on your site that were linking to the old location and then changing it in for the new location. You want to do that because it saves resources. Simple as that. It's just useless effort thrown away.
People need to have redirects in place for a short period of time as well, because Google likes the hygiene of going to 404, doesn't it? After a certain period of time, so it knows to take it out of the index.
Yeah, so 404s are not as bad as perceived, because 404 sometimes just have the purpose of saying this content is just simply no longer here. Probably the better version would be a 410. This used to be here, but no longer care for it, so you can delete it. But those are signals that you can use, and you should use them. It's just content health, something that you should want to do.
Okay, so next up was DNS. You mentioned DNS in your list of things which can be tackled.
Yep.
What can we do? What's the problems?
DNS, like any other component inside the internet, can be slow. So if you're using a service that is just not up to spec, a hyper local version of some domain register that you're using, and it happens to be a .com site that services the entire world, will always see a less optimized version of DNS resolving than something that is built for that. Again, Cloudflare is a great, simple solution that solves this wonderfully. It reduces the lookup time, so the time it is required from typing in example.com to actually knowing, okay, so that's that server that needs to respond. It helps in stabilizing, but there's more premium DNS solutions out there than just Cloudflare. But something like that, a premium solution for DNS will help you give you a stable version of a connection. They also do the caching part of that lookup way better. So, for instance, if you've ever meddled with DNS, there's one of the attributes there is the time to live, TTL. A premium solution knows what to cache longer than 24 hours and what needs to be 5 minutes short. It essentially means where you can cache, where you can optimize, you should, and DNS is no exception to that.
And it's important because of one of the core web vitals is time to first byte, right? Or we look at time
It's
to
part
first
of that.
byte.
Yeah.
And a slow DNS response impacts on your time to first byte, which is essentially the first point at which people start to receive the data for your website or your app or the content you're trying to deliver to them. So if you're slowing down at the front, actually everything else is just going to take longer.
Not only that, it actually compounds. So a slow time to first byte, it actually compounds into way more than that, just that slow part once traffic really starts hitting. because it's not cached and it needs to do more than it should be doing. And then you can compare it to your computer when it just starts showing okay, I don't know how to process what you're asking here, and just sort of stalls. It's an oversimplification, but that generally happens with DNS and a few other metrics that are to do with time to first byte. But it essentially means that the more you have that non-optimized, the more it's going to hurt in terms of larger volume of traffic. And uh, high traffic is a perfect example of all the problems that arise for high traffic sites. They're happening for low traffic sites as well. You're just not bothered by it too much because it doesn't show that much, or doesn't hurt as much, but it does.
Okay, so on this call, at least, we're all heavy users of WordPress, and I guess it would be really a perfect conversation to have is how does WordPress manage this? Historically, has it been good in terms of performance? What are the endeavors, the projects going on at the moment to ensure that it's performant in the future? What does it handle well? What does it do not so well? So it's a generic question, but let's just throw it at you, Remkus. How does WordPress do in terms of performance?
WordPress handles performance just fine. Now, I say just fine because there's the perception that WordPress cannot be performant. And sure, 15, 10 years ago, things were not as good as they are now. I think WordPress is being blamed for not being performant more because of really bad hosting setup than actual WordPress. So, having said that, WordPress is only fast when the person built or the people building it know what they're doing. That means from a platform perspective, that means from a code perspective, that means from a what am I loading and when am I loading it and how am I optimizing the loading of it perspective. If you adhere to understanding what you need to know about the platform to implement it in your build, then WordPress can be as performant as you can possibly want it to be. So there's really not a big limitation there. It really boils down to if you understand the platform, then it can be super performant. It can be super fast, and it can do a lot of different things, especially combining it with caching techniques that offload the cache in front of WordPress instead of having WordPress doing it. It scales wonderfully. There's this thing going around that WordPress stops being performant once you add a bunch of plugins. And some say even after 30, your site really starts to slow down. I disagree with that. I think it's incredibly important to understand that you need to understand what those plugins are doing. If those plugins are built to escape early, so they don't do anything unless they have to do it, then it is by intent. If the plugin is not loading all of its things on every single page load, doesn't necessarily have to be outputted, but just being active on every single page load doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you keep that in mind, then the number of plugins really is not that big of an issue. I have a few client sites that have close to 100 plugins, and a few of those have a shit ton of functions inside of them. Like there's a lot going on, and they are not an issue. That's not the issue. The issue is not understanding the platform. A hosting company that doesn't understand, that wants to limit you in one way or another, whether that is because their design of how their containers work or how their hardware works, how their software works, I don't care. But as soon as a hosting company, for instance, starts limiting you on your workers, that's an indication of, okay, does this work for me? Because workers essentially means I'm throttling your PHP resources. From a performance standpoint, not a situation where I would like to be. But especially if I'm looking at mediocre hosting or okay hosting, then that is an indicator that I'm going to be limited by the number of things I'm doing on that site way more than if I'm just on blazingly fast hosting. Just the base principle of that should be evident, but the stories going around on the internet hide the reality where it's not about the number of plugins, but what is actually happening inside of those plugins.
I think one of the things that's positive for me is that WordPress has a performance team, and that performance team as the goal in mind of continually improving performance. And if we look at other types of content management system, sure, they might have somebody going on in the background, but they don't have a team necessarily that is just driving this performance forward. And I think that's what sets WordPress apart. What are the sorts of things that the WordPress performance team has added to the platform over recent releases and is coming in the future?
So they made huge strides with making WordPress as performant as possible. I would say, especially in 2023, there have been a number of very old, outstanding tickets have been solved, and they're roughly in two categories. One of the categories is optimizing the loading of what needs to be loaded, right? So the images lazy loading is turned on by default now. There's an optimization happening from 6.2 to 6.3, which will be even made better in 6.4, which is, I guess, released next week. Where the lazy loading is even more optimized, more tuned to what actually is needed. So that's one component of whatever we're doing it smarter in terms of loading stuff. But where I'm most happy with is the stuff that's being done on the query side of things. So there have been quite a few non-default versions of queries happening, non-default being anything else than a regular page, a regular post, or the regular archive, where they have made huge strides in terms of performance, in terms of caching internally better, especially combined with Object Cache, and then especially combined with Object Cache Pro. That particular plugin is just worth its weight in gold. What that team does has been improving all of the edge cases where there's one of the sites that I maintain is 18 years old. It's on WordPress, and for the last 18 years, every single day, 10 to 13 posts have been published. So you do the math on how many posts that are, and then there's all the other stuff that's happening there. So that site has hundreds and thousands of posts, if not already a million. Now, typically that means that site is perceived as slow. It's not, because it's on a proper platform. That's one. And the other part is that over the last 2 years, WordPress has improved tremendously in terms of internal caching of all those different types of queries, that it is just as performant as any other WordPress site. Meaning, you wouldn't notice the difference unless I told you, look at the number of posts in that table. And you go, oh, okay, that's a lot. So WordPress is fast if you know what you're doing. WordPress can be faster if you optimize every single layer, and if you optimize the code that is interacting with it.
And I think that WordPress, because of its reach and because of its scope, it powers 43% of the internet, millions and millions and millions of sites on it. You get into a situation where there are people that know the platform and understand it deeply, and people that, almost give it a bad rep because they're using it without fully understanding what they should be doing or how they should be doing. And then it impacts on the overall perception of WordPress as a whole. One other thing that I wanted to talk about was the difference between the front-end website and the content administration screens, the back end of WordPress. We use different CMSs. We use commercial CMSs and have done for many years as well. And so we understand that actually some of them are quite slow on the back end, particularly if you run them for the first time, they're very slow. One of the things that we like about WordPress is how fast it is for a content editor on the back end. Is there anything from a performance point of view that needs to be done on the back end to ensure that speed is maintained when a site grows?
I would chuck this up to database management. So if you're using default MySQL, then there's versions of MariaDB that will help you. There's modules within MariaDB that will help you. So that's already a more optimized version. Use modern storage engines, use indices where you can, where it makes sense, that sort of thing. And ideally, you want to have a hosting company that understands the interaction that is required for for the web server to connect to the database server. If you are using cloud instance, for instance, that usually means the database server is on a different server, like physically different server than the web server. That in and of itself introduces latency. And if not done correctly, that's going to hurt. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do, but it revolves around what are you smart enough about doing to your database layer. What I mentioned previously, ObjectCache Pro combined with Redis solves most of your problems there if you are having them. But those are the things to look at.
So we've discussed many things that may impact the performance of your website. It kind of strikes me that a lot of people listening to this may want some guidance as to where they could go, what online resources you would recommend. So it may be, I don't know, good old-fashioned books that you want to mention, or websites, or software, anything like that. So yeah, just a list of favorite things that you would advise people to familiarize themselves with in terms of website performance.
Web.dev. So that's Google's resource in terms of everything having to do with core Web Vitals, but all the things related to that as well. They also share what the new changes are going to be, so what's coming, what's new. They discuss different kinds of strategies for different types of optimizations. So that is a treasure trove of information. I think that's probably the most interesting one to deep dive into because the rest of the information is scattered. That you can find a good tutorial here, a good tutorial there. I do my best in my weekly newsletter to share some performance related articles or tips or tricks or things of that nature. So, but it's difficult. There's no one place where all of that resides. The main one would be web.dev. In terms of favorite tools, I think so the answers I've given have had a lot of Cloudflare in them. And I'm not just a regular Cloudflare fanboy, but it's more of the whole DNA of that company is built around the idea to solve performance problems, period. So that means the way they have their databases, the way they're using workers. And if all of these words mean nothing to you, just head over to cloudflare.com and start looking at what they're offering. The image optimizations, the stuff that you can do to optimize JavaScript. All of these things that Cloudflare is doing is just the smart way to do it. It's so smart that they introduce new versions of existing protocols, for instance. And some of those, getting protocols changed is a long process. But some of the changes that they have implemented on their own platform have made it to the general protocol changes, for instance. Understanding what Cloudflare can do is going to solve a lot of your edge cases, literally, and I guess figuratively as well. In terms of tools, one of the tools that I'm very excited about because I'm building it currently with my co-founder, Barry Coy, is called ScanFully. And its goal is to have you be in the know of what is happening on your WordPress site. Meaning we scan for performance, we scan for uptime, we check what's happening on your site, we register the things that you do on your site. So for instance, if anybody's ever built a site and handed it over to a client, and that client then in 5 weeks says, look, I don't know what happened, but the site is slow as hell. What's going on? And then you ask the client, you investigate, you ask the client like, okay, but did you change anything? And the client goes like, no, of course not. And then you're kind of stuck because, the client said no, and you obviously see reasons why you suspected that that was the case. Our tool will allow you to find, okay, so something changed around here. What happened? Okay, look, there's some few database changes. So the client obviously did change some things. Oh, look, he deleted a plugin and he activated another one. And that has an impact. So getting yourself in the know of what's happening on that site in terms of site health, content health, or performance. That's why we're building ScanFully. So, and we're building it because I couldn't find any tool that did all of that from a WordPress perspective. And the last one is whatever browser you're using, familiarize yourself with whatever inspect element shows you, because there's a lot of treasures in there of small little tools and little things that you can employ to test your performance, test what's going on the site, play with it. Not just the lighthouse thing. Just my favorite probably is network, and just seeing the waterfall of what happens as stuff is loading inside your site.
Oh, thank you for that, Remkus. Thanks for the recommendations. But you mentioned ScanFully. Obviously, that's your own project.
Yeah.
An opportunity to plug. Where do we find it?
Scanfully.com. Currently in private beta, but the goal is to either by the end of this year, but most likely in January, we'll open the early access.
So ScanFully, ScanFully.com,
Yes,
ScanFully.com.
sir.
So we mentioned when we clicked record that essentially this is a topic which has no end. We're going to be talking about this in the decades to come.
Yeah.
Given that, there must be a whole lot of things which are coming down the pike, new initiatives, new things, roadmaps, if you like, for performance. Do you have any intuitions as to what's coming down the pike, what we might be wise to look at the end of 2023 for the future?
Yes and no. So I'll cover the no first. So there's so much happening on so many different levels that it's hard to keep track of from a predictive standpoint. There's just not, so we don't know what new technologies will be available next month for which we should be adjusting. Whether that is a new image format, whether that's a smarter way to use JavaScript, whether that's a smarter way to write efficient PHP code with 8.2, 3, what are we going to? Um, those things are hard because that means you need to really deep dive into what's next and follow all the tickets and see what discussions. That's a task in and of itself. Having said that, there are some things you can look for, and I would again point you in the direction of web.dev for the simple reason that if there are new ways and new metrics to start using inside of Core Web Vitals, for instance, then that's the first place you'll find it. It's, for instance, also the place where you can find that there's a new metric coming up called INP. And INP is something that's going to have a huge impact on your site. It's not currently activated just yet, but just know it's coming up. Meaning, I think they're saying now it's like March, April, and it's a new metric inside of Core Web Vitals. You want to understand this one. You want to solve this one because it's going to be a big impact in terms of your total score. The rest of the stuff is very hard to predict. There's some stuff happening here, some stuff happening there. Again, I'm going to sound like a fanboy by now, but Cloudflare is a good indication to look for what they're doing in terms of problems they're solving, because they are, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people working at Cloudflare who are just focused on optimizing whatever layer they can find. That's most likely my best advice to start paying attention to. But INP is for sure something you need to focus on. Whatever comes after, in terms of WordPress, keep following what the WordPress Performance Core team does. WordPress Core Performance team. I always forget the sequence. They are constantly updating stuff that we're doing within WordPress, functions and codes and methods and stuff like that. So keep an eye on what's happening there. You can follow them in the Slack channel and the tickets that they have assigned to them on track, and it'll give you a great idea of what's happening in the future and stuff that you can optimize for. Meaning, as soon as 6.4 lands, there's quite a few things you should be optimizing for if you're using certain functions having to do with queries and object hash and stuff like that.
As luck would have it, the crew over at Filter have produced an ebook all about performance. So I guess it would be apropos of Paul to tell us a little bit about that. What have you produced there, Paul?
So one of our enterprise guides, we're doing a series of enterprise guides all around different topics around web and app. And we've done one on performance, and Remkus was a contributor to that ebook, as well as Felix, Arntz, who was leading the WordPress core performance team as well. And you can download that for free at the Filter site, which is filter.agency.
Okay, so that's all we've got time for on this episode of Unfiltered. Thank you so much, Remkus, for joining us today and talking to us all about performance. Really appreciate that.
You're
I
welcome.
have been Nathan.
I've been Paul.
The next episode will be all about sustainability, so hopefully you will join us for that. For now, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paul.